Samuel Hartman traced the engraved letters of Grace's name on the icy Oregon tombstone, his breath clouding the air like the promises he'd failed to keep. The war had taken his youth, her eyes locking onto his with a hope that felt like betrayal. The wind carried the smell of iron and wet pine as it slid between the rows of headstones. December in Fort Cascade always felt older than the rest of the year, as if the land itself remembered every name etched in stone. Samuel Hartman stood at the edge of the gravel path, boots heavy with mud, his breath leaving thin ribbons of white that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The cemetery stretched out in quiet symmetry, gray markers biting into the frost-hardened earth. He adjusted the collar of his worn field jacket, the fabric frayed at the edges where fingers had clutched it too tightly during colder nights far from home. He walked without hurry. Each step sounded muted against the ground, like he was intruding on a conversation that ended long before he arrived. His hand, gloved and wool-thinned from years of use, clutched a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. They trembled slightly. He didn't speak. There was nothing left in words that could bridge the space between the living and the gone. The air was quiet except for the faint whistle of the wind moving between the markers, a low hum that sounded almost like breath. His fingers brushed the top edge of the stone, pausing on the carved curve of her first initial. The cold surface carried nothing of her, but his hand lingered there anyway. He thought of her laugh, how it used to spill out unplanned, catching him off guard even in the ugliest places on earth. He thought of her hands, convinced he was saving her from a life of half-promises and empty cribs. In the stillness, that old decision pressed on his chest like a weight he could no longer carry. The wind shifted suddenly. He opened his eyes again and looked at the empty space beside the headstone, the patch of earth that would one day hold him too. There was no fear in the thought, just a strange kind of understanding. Watched it vanish like every other trace of warmth. He leaned forward slightly, forehead almost touching the top of the stone, and for the first time since stepping into the cemetery, he let his shoulders drop. No salutes, no prayers, just a man and a name and a silence thick enough to swallow both. Somewhere inside that silence, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet. As if the whole world held its breath. Samuel stayed kneeling, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, the bouquet already beginning to gather tiny beads of frost on its petals. His gloves smelled faintly of iron and wool, since that never seemed to wash away no matter how long he'd been home. He traced the edge of the stone again, slower this time, like learning a shape he once knew by heart, but had forgotten through years of distance. There was a time when coming home had meant Grace's voice at the door, but this was the kind of weight you couldn't shift from one shoulder to the other. It just lived in you. The wind curled around him again, a soft drag of cold across the back of his neck. He let it wash over, not fighting the chill. It felt honest, the kind of honesty that stripped you bare without asking permission. He thought of the last letter she'd sent before they stopped writing altogether. Not angry, not pleading, just quiet. Grace had always known how to make silence speak louder than words. He'd read it once, folded it away, and told himself it was for the best. Soldiers were good at convincing themselves of things. It kept you alive. It didn't keep you whole. A gust of wind shook the branches above, a few brittle leaves skittering across the path behind him. He turned slightly at the sound, half expecting nothing, half expecting her. Old habits. You heard something behind you. You checked your six. Except this wasn't a battlefield. It was supposed to be a place of rest. But the air held something else. A tremor. A pause. Sam's breath slowed without him meaning to. He stayed still, listening. And then it came, soft, almost swallowed by the wind. A sound small enough to be mistaken for a trick of the air. A broken sob. He froze, head tilting slightly, muscles tightening in the way they did before you saw something you weren't sure you wanted to see. The sound came again, not louder, just closer somehow. Not an echo. Not the past. Something here. Now. He turned fully, eyes scanning the thin veil of fog that hovered near the ground. The cemetery was empty, the gravel path lined with shadows of stones. Then, as if not to break whatever fragile thing had entered this space, the bouquet lay forgotten at the base of the stone, white against gray. The sob came once more, clearer now. A child's sound. The kind that pulled something instinctive and raw out of a man whether he wanted it or not. Samuel's heart kicked once, hard against his chest. His fingers flexed unconsciously. But no words came. Instead, the girl lifted her head, and her eyes, red-rimmed, too old for her face, found his. Her eyes were the kind that made sound feel unnecessary, wide, raw, though there was something in her gaze that carried a weight far older. A small hand peeked from the folds of her oversized coat, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit whose fur had thinned to a patchy gray. One of its ears hung limp, barely attached by a frayed thread. The girl's breath came in tiny puffs. He noticed her coat then. Too big. The sleeves swallowed her hands. The collar brushed her chin. It wasn't a child's coat. It was borrowed. Something about that detail pressed on his chest in a way he couldn't name. She hugged the rabbit closer, shoulders hunching like she could fold herself into something invisible. And then, so softly it might have been a breath slipping from her lips, the word came. Daddy. It wasn't a question. Not quite a statement either. Just a sound carrying across the thin space between grief and hope. Samuel felt the world tilt. Not the sudden drop of fear, but the slow, heavy lean of something cracking open inside. His throat tightened, unprepared for the way that single word could dig through years of silence and land in the place he'd buried everything. Palms out, the way you might when approaching a wounded animal. Not fear, respect. His mouth opened, 100 words jamming at once behind his teeth, none of them right. What could you possibly say to a child in a cemetery who looked at you like you were the answer to a question she hadn't dared to ask out loud? His lips parted anyway, breath forming something half-formed, half-held. What did you? But he didn't finish, because the look in her eyes shifted just slightly, like the tiniest ripple on still water. She blinked once, just that one word echoing softly, and the small hitch in her breathing afterward as if speaking it had taken all the strength she had left. She shifted slightly. The stuffed rabbit slipped a little in her grasp, and she clutched it tighter with both hands as though the worn toy was the only thing holding her together. Samuel's eyes caught the faint stain of dirt on the side of her cheek, a thin track where earlier tears had cut through. The smallness of her hit him then, not just her size, but the way her whole body seemed to be folding in on itself, like something trying not to disappear. His instinct told him to move, to go to her, but something older, quieter told him to wait. You didn't rush a thing this fragile. You let it decide if it wanted to reach for you. So he stayed there, standing in the cold, his own hands hanging loose at his sides, trying to show with stillness what he couldn't put into words. I'm here. I see you. When he finally found his voice, it came out low, softer than he expected. Hey, just one syllable. She whispered again, quieter than before, the sound almost breaking on her lips. Daddy, Mom said you'd find me. Lowering him until his knees touched the cold earth. They ached instantly from the chill, but he barely felt it. He was level with her now. When her eyes lifted to his again, there was no fear in them, only something that looked achingly like belief. He hadn't earned that. Not yet. But it was there anyway, resting in her gaze like a gift too fragile to touch. Samuel swallowed hard. His hand twitched once, then slowly, carefully, he reached out, not all the way, just enough for the gesture to be seen. Breathing shallow in the winter air, her eyes locked on his as if waiting to see if he'd vanish like everything else had. And for the first time in years, Samuel Hartman wished for nothing more than to be solid enough to stay. The sound of footsteps came first, soft against the gravel, deliberate in the way someone walks when they already know where they're going. Samuel's head turned slowly toward the path. Through the pale curtain of fog, a figure emerged, tall. The man's pace didn't falter when he saw them. If anything, it steadied, like this was a scene he expected to find. Emily. The man's voice cut gently through the air, and Samuel noticed the slightest tremor ripple through her shoulders. The man came closer, his shoes crunching the frost-bitten grass. When he was only a few feet away, his eyes flicked briefly to Samuel. There was nothing hurried in his expression, nothing overtly threatening either. Politeness worn like a press suit. She tends to wander, the man said. His tone even practiced. He crouched slightly, reaching a hand out toward the girl. You scare me, sweetheart. The girl shrank back. Not much, just enough to make it unmistakable. The sleeve of her oversized coat brushed the cold ground as she tried to make herself smaller. Samuel's jaw tightened without him meaning to. Something in that small movement tugged at an old instinct, the one that had made him pull brothers out of collapsing walls and burning convoys. His knees were still in the dirt, body half-angled between the man and the child without realizing he'd shifted that way. She was crying, Samuel heard himself say, his voice low but carrying more gravel than the path beneath them, like someone trying not to spook a skittish animal. And then it happened. The girl's voice, small but clear in the heavy air. Mom said, "You'd find me." The man's hand froze midair. It was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. The fractional pause, the fingers curling slightly before he forced them back into stillness. Samuel's breath sat heavy in his chest, unmoving. "What's your name?" Samuel asked the girl quietly, his eyes still on the man. Her lips parted, the answer trembling out like it had been waiting a long time to escape. "Amelia, but Mom calls me Leah." The man's smile didn't crack, but Samuel saw it, the brief tension at the corner of his mouth, the way his next breath caught half a beat too late. "That's enough. Emily," the man said, firmer now. He slipped the name between them like a wall. "Let's get you home." Emily. Leah. Two names sitting heavy in the cold. The girl didn't move, didn't stand. Her small hand found the edge of Samuel's worn glove, not holding, just touching, like a question. Samuel rose slowly, the motion quiet, controlled. He was taller than the man, broader in the shoulders, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the instinct burning low and steady in his gut, the one that whispered something here was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, but wrong all the same. The man extended his hand once more, his smile returning, too even, too rehearsed. "Thank you for looking after her," he said smoothly. "Kids get lost sometimes." Quiet as it was, would change everything. The man's hand hung there, a polite gesture suspended in the frozen air. For a second, no one moved. The fog around them seemed to hold still too, as if the cemetery itself was waiting to see what would happen. Samuel's knees ached from the cold ground, but he didn't rise yet. His body had shifted instinctively. They rested against the edge of his glove, light as the first brush of snow. It wasn't a hold, more like a test, as if she needed to know he was real. Samuel let his hand stay where it was. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. Some things were better answered in stillness. The man, Richard. If Samuel had to guess from the way the girl had flinched at Emily, straightened his glasses with his free hand. His smile didn't fade, but it felt thinner now, stretched across something brittle. The girl's eyes flickered once. She didn't answer, didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on Samuel, wide and wet and unwavering. It wasn't desperation in her eyes. It was something quieter and sharper, recognition. Samuel finally rose, slow and deliberate, his knees stiff as he stood. The girl's fingers slid off his glove as he moved, leaving a strange emptiness on his skin where her touch had been. He stood between her and the man without meaning to, his shoulders squared, not threatening, just solid, the way you might stand when holding a line. She was crying, Samuel said, his voice even but low, like gravel rolled under boots. Richard's smile didn't falter, though his eyes cooled a fraction. "Yes, she does that sometimes. Cemeteries can be overwhelming for children." Samuel tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Not for her," he said, almost under his breath. The man's expression flickered so fast it might have been the wind. Then the smile returned, smooth as glass. "Thank you for staying with her. We should be going now." He reached again, and this time the girl stood, though not toward him. She stayed near Samuel's leg, the coat brushing against his boot. Her small hand found the stuffed rabbit again, gripping it like a shield. Samuel looked down at her, at the faint dirt smudge on her cheek and the two big sleeves hiding her wrists. Richard's eyes followed the movement. For the first time, the politeness in his expression slipped, just a hairline crack. "She's shy," he said quickly, as if to fill the space. Samuel didn't answer. His throat felt tight, his body heavy in the cold air, as if her small body understood something her voice couldn't yet say. Finally, Samuel stepped back, giving the smallest nod. Richard exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Samuel until the fog swallowed them both down the path, the man's long coat trailing like a shadow. Not empty, but full of questions of the weight of something unnamed. He looked at the spot where the girl had sat, the faint impression of her in the frosted grass. And for the first time in years, Samuel Hartman felt the old battlefield sense humming under his skin. Not danger. Not yet. What a shift. A crack in the world he thought was buried under stone. The fog was closing in again. Thin fingers of mist curling low along the ground, blurring the neat lines of the cemetery into soft gray shapes. Samuel stayed there for a long moment. It was then he noticed it. Something small resting near the base of the headstone where she had been sitting, half hidden in the frostbitten grass. He reached down slowly, his glove brushing the frozen blades as he picked it up. It was a photograph, edges curled, the gloss worn to a muted sheen from too many touches. For a second, he almost expected it to dissolve in his hand like something not meant to be held. He turned it over gently, the stiff paper creaking faintly in the cold. The image hit him like a blow. Grace, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, pale blue gown loose around her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back hastily, stray strands framing her face in soft disarray. She looked exhausted, careful not to crease it, but needing to feel it anchored in his grip. He stared at her face, memorizing every line as if afraid the photograph might vanish if he blinked too long. At the bottom corner, faint but deliberate, was a handwritten note for Sam. His knees gave slightly, dropping him back into the cold earth. The chill seeped through the fabric of his jeans. But he didn't move. His gloved thumb traced the ink, the small tremor in the handwriting. Grace's handwriting. He hadn't seen it in years, yet his body recognized it instantly, like muscle memory. He swallowed hard, his throat tight enough to ache. The photograph trembled once in his hand, a movement he couldn't control. He remembered the last time he'd seen her, the quiet in her eyes, the way she held herself like someone already letting go. He'd told himself walking away was the right thing, that he was sparing her, that a man broken by war and a body that couldn't give her children wasn't worth tethering a life to. But now, kneeling in the brittle grass with that photograph burning cold in his glove, the truth pressed and sharp. Whatever he thought he'd spared her from, he hadn't spared himself. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. He glanced instinctively toward the fog where the girl had disappeared, the echo of her voice still clinging to the air. "Daddy." He turned the photo over, searching for anything more. She had been sitting at Grace's grave holding this photograph like a secret she couldn't keep anymore. Samuel exhaled slowly, his breath shuddering. His other hand came up, pressing against the top of the headstone as if to steady himself, or maybe to steady the world that felt like it was tilting under him. The cold stone bit into his glove, raw and heavy, not with anger, but with something deeper, something like longing mixed with fear. He didn't voice it. There was no one to answer it here. For a while he just sat there, carrying the faintest whisper of pine and loss and something else he couldn't name. Something that felt a little like hope and a little like grief stitched together, impossible to separate. The photograph was light in Samuel's hand, but it carried the weight of years. He held it close, as if proximity alone might bring back the warmth in Grace's cheeks or the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to every hospital room she'd ever worked in. His glove brushed the edge again, careful, reverent. The paper crackled softly under the pressure, the fragile sound of something that had survived when everything else hadn't. The baby's face in the picture was only a suggestion of features, soft skin, a small shadow of a nose, a fist half curled like it was trying to hold onto the world. But it wasn't the infant that held him in place. It was Grace. Her eyes, even exhausted, there was that fire, that unshakable steadiness he'd leaned on more times than he'd ever said aloud. He remembered those eyes across makeshift camps and sand-swept tents, across nights where the world narrowed to survival and the sound of her voice telling him he was still human. For Sam. 2 words. Small, uneven letters. His name, written by a hand that had once traced the scars on his back in the dark. His thumb pressed over the ink, not to smudge it, just to feel it under the fabric of his glove. He'd spent years convincing himself that leaving had been an act of mercy. But this piece of paper, this frozen moment of her cradling a life that shouldn't have been possible, cut through every quiet lie he'd built to live with that choice. His breath caught in his chest, a raw, unfinished sound scraping against the cold air. The ground under his knees felt harder now, as if the earth itself had shifted with the truth he was holding. He stared at the photo until the edges blurred, blinking away the sting at the corners of his eyes. He didn't cry. Not here. Not yet. Soldiers learned how to lock it down, even when the war was over. The back of the photograph was mostly blank, just a faint crease down the center from being folded once too many times. At the corner, almost invisible, a smudge the size of a fingertip. And in the darkness behind his lids, he saw Grace's smile. Not the bright one she wore in the daylight, but the small, private curve of her lips when she thought no one was looking. Sharper this time, lifting the edges of his jacket and carrying with it the faint sound of something distant, a door slamming, or maybe just the cemetery gate shifting in the cold. Samuel didn't move. His hand slid down the headstone until his palm rested flat against the name carved there. The chill seeped through the wool, biting his skin. "Grace," he whispered, as if the world had decided to pull them into a smaller, quieter place. He slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where it pressed against the steady thud of his heart. For the first time in years, that beat felt too loud, too alive in the silence. Back on his heels, looking again at the faint imprint in the grass where the girl had been. The cold had already begun to erase it, smoothing the blades back to uniform frost. He reached out anyway, fingers brushing the spot as if he could hold on to something that was already fading. His voice stayed inside this time. Words felt too heavy, too clumsy for a moment held together by nothing but breath and absence. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from the cold. The chrysanthemums at the base of the stone were rimmed with ice now, tiny crystals clinging to white petals. Samuel adjusted his jacket, the weight of the photograph a new gravity against his ribs. When he finally turned toward the path, the fog parted slightly, just heavier in the way it does when the past stops being a memory and starts breathing again. The gravel crunched beneath Samuel's boots as he left the headstone behind, though each step felt reluctant, as if the earth itself wanted him to stay kneeling there forever. The December air had grown heavier, carrying a kind of stillness that pressed against his skin. He paused just short of it, his fingers brushing the cold metal before gripping it loosely. Beyond the gate, the world stretched out in muted winter colors, faded asphalt, skeletal trees. The faint glow of a distant streetlight fighting the fog. He'd driven here without knowing why. Now he knew he wouldn't be driving away the same man. His truck sat alone at the edge of the narrow parking lot, a battered Chevy that had seen more miles than he cared to count. Samuel slid behind the wheel, the seat springs creaking under his weight, and sat there for a moment without turning the key. The photograph was still in his pocket, but he could see it perfectly without pulling it out. Grace on that bed, the faint curve of her tired smile, the small bundle in her arms. For Sam. He let his head fall back against the seat, eyes closing briefly. The last time he'd seen her, there had been no photograph, no baby. The hospital name was faint, but readable on the bottom corner of the photograph. He knew the building before he even finished saying in his head, St. Helena, a small regional facility 2 hours west, tucked between the highway and a stretch of fir trees. Grace had worked there once, years ago, after leaving the military. He pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching over gravel before finding the slick blacktop of the county road. The fog clung low to the ground, his headlights cutting through it in pale, short beams. The drive stretched quiet and long, the kind of winter road where the world seems to narrow to just you and the hum of the engine. His hands rested heavy on the steering wheel, knuckles pale under worn leather gloves. He thought of her again, not the woman in the photograph, but the girl he'd met in a field hospital in Afghanistan, sleeves rolled to her elbows, voice steady over the chaos around them. Grace had always been the one to anchor him when everything else was falling apart. Now she was gone, and in her place was a photograph and a child who had called him a name he hadn't heard in years. Daddy. The sound of it replayed in his head, soft but sharp. Samuel's jaw tightened as he turned off the highway, the truck bumping slightly over the uneven pavement of the access road. The hospital rose out of the mist a few minutes later, watching his breath fog the cab. His hand went to his jacket pocket again, fingers closing around the photograph as if to remind himself it was real. He didn't know what he expected to find inside that building. Records. Answers. Maybe just another door slammed shut. Samuel stepped out into the cold, boots hitting the pavement with a soft, final sound. The air smelled faintly of rain and disinfectant, the hospital's signature scent reaching even this far out. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the glass doors. They slid open with a low hiss, letting out a wash of warm, sterile air that felt almost foreign after the bite of winter outside. The lobby was quiet. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of a nurse behind a desk. Samuel hesitated for half a heartbeat before crossing the threshold, the weight in his chest shifting from grief to something closer to resolve. Whatever waited in here, he needed to see it, needed to touch the truth with his own hands, even if it broke him open in ways he couldn't put back together. The photograph pressed against his ribs with every step, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him but was somehow keeping him alive. The automatic doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, sealing away the cold outside and replacing it with the faint hum of forced heat and antiseptic. St. Helena's lobby hadn't changed much since the last time he'd been in a place like this. A few faded posters on the wall, the muted glow of fluorescent bulbs, and the low, steady beeping from somewhere far down the hall. Samuel paused just inside, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh light after the muted fog of the cemetery and the road. His boots left faint wet prints on the tile as he crossed to the reception desk. The nurse on duty, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes but a kind face, looked up as he approached. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was soft, carrying the practiced calm of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where panic tried to live. Samuel hesitated a second too long before reaching into his jacket. The photograph slid from his pocket, the paper cool against his fingers as he placed it carefully on the counter. Now, Samuel's chest tightened at the name. Paul Raines. He hadn't heard it in years. The last time, it had been shouted over the sound of gunfire and sand whipping through the air. They had both walked out of that hell, though barely. A door near the end of the hall opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed against the tile. Samuel turned just as the man emerged. Taller than he remembered, hair gone mostly white, but the same steady gait, the same eyes that had seen too much and kept going anyway. Dr. Paul Raines stopped mid-step when his gaze landed on Samuel. "Sam Hartman," he said, low and almost disbelieving, the way you might say the name of someone you'd already buried once in your head. The night they'd both carried a boy half their age through the dark with nothing but a prayer and duct tape holding him together. He picked up the photo gently, as if it might bruise under his touch. His thumb brushed the corner where the ink read for Sam. He let out a slow breath. "Grace," he murmured, not looking at Samuel. "God, she was here." Samuel swallowed hard. "She had a baby, didn't she?" Paul's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. He didn't answer right away, just placed the photo back on the counter with deliberate care. "Come with me." His voice was low, almost reverent, like the walls themselves shouldn't hear. They walked down the hall together, the soles of their shoes whispering against the tile. Samuel's eyes caught glimpses of lives happening behind thin curtains. A woman sleeping, a man sitting by a bed holding someone's hand. Ordinary moments. Fragile ones. He felt like an intruder in a place built for beginnings and endings, carrying the ghost of both in his chest. Paul pushed open a small door at the end of the corridor. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. He motioned for Samuel to sit, but Samuel stayed standing, hands braced against the back of the chair like he needed something solid to hold on to. Paul opened a drawer, rifling through a stack of old files until he pulled one free. The folder was worn, the tab labeled in fading ink. Hartman, Grace, 2018. He laid it on the desk, gently, like setting down a living thing. Samuel stared at it, his breath shallow. Paul flipped it open, the sound of paper soft but deafening in the quiet room. His fingers curled tight against the chair. He couldn't make himself speak. The words on the page swam in and out of focus as something inside him cracked open wider. Paul's voice came softly. A man who had delivered hard truths before. She didn't list a father. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. There were no words for the weight of knowing and not knowing all at once. Something that might move if he looked away. His fingers hovered over the page without touching it, tracing the air above the black letters as if the distance could soften their weight. He wasn't watching the file. He was watching Samuel the way only someone who'd once dragged you through a firefight could. Steady, patient, knowing. She didn't tell you. It wasn't a question. The hospital's logo was faint, stamped in the corner, already beginning to fade after years in the drawer. The line under father's name sat empty. A stark blank space that said more than any words could have. It wasn't neglect. It was a choice. Paul's voice stayed low even. Grace came in alone. No one with her. No one waiting outside. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly in a way Samuel remembered from triage tents. Measured, careful, the tone you used when you were balancing truth with mercy. She asked for a private room. Kept to herself. The nurses said she smiled when the baby cried for the first time. But there was something else there. Oh wait. Samuel let the words settle into him. He tried to picture what she must have been thinking, what fear or hope had pressed her to leave that line blank. He sank slowly into the chair, his elbows finding his knees, the file resting between his hands. Why didn't she? His voice caught again, softer this time. Why didn't she tell me? Paul didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. You know Grace. She carried things herself when she thought it would spare someone else. Maybe she thought she was protecting you. Maybe the baby. Maybe both. Samuel let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite a sob, just a low exhale that scraped through his chest. His thumb brushed over the child's name again. Amelia. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the faint scratch of Paul's pen as he jotted a note in the margin of another file. Samuel sat back. The question slipped out before he even knew he was going to ask it. Paul hesitated, then reached into the folder, pulling out a single sheet clipped to the back. She didn't leave much of a trail, but she signed discharge papers for a transfer. He slid the paper across the desk. Samuel leaned forward, eyes catching the stamp at the bottom. Haven Pines, New Roots Program. The same words from the corner of the photograph. The same faint chill curling low in his gut. Paul's voice softened even further. Sam, if you're going after this, be careful. For the first time since stepping into the cemetery that morning, Samuel felt something other than the hollow ache of loss. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was purpose, raw and quiet. The sound small but sharp in the still room. He met Paul's eyes and nodded once, a silent thanks heavier than words. Outside, the hospital hallway stretched pale and long, the lights humming above. Samuel's boots echoed softly against the floor as he walked, the file still warm from his hands. Each step felt deliberate now, each breath measured against the new weight in his chest. When he stepped back into the cold, the December wind met him with open hands, cutting through the heat, still clinging to his jacket. He didn't pull it tighter. He let the cold in. Amelia Grace Hartman. The name had rooted itself deep, where even the cold couldn't reach. His truck sat alone under the dim yellow of the parking lot light. But it wasn't the stamp that made his breath catch. It was the signature at the bottom. Grace Hartman. Or at least it was supposed to be. Samuel had read her handwriting 1,000 times in notes scribbled on ration boxes, in letters folded into the corners of his duffel bag. In the one sentence she'd left the day he walked away. Be safe, even without me. Her script had always leaned slightly right, delicate curves with a weight that came from someone careful with words. This was different. Upright, rigid, checking for impressions in the paper. Nothing but the faint texture of the hospital's standard stock. His other hand went to the photograph. The hum of the world outside, muted by the thick December air. The name Haven Pines sat etched in his mind now. The word from the discharge stamp curling around the faint memory of the man in the long gray coat. The way the girl had flinched at Emily. He closed his eyes briefly. The girl's voice threading through the silence of the truck. Daddy, Mom said you'd find me. Under his skin since the cemetery, but now it carried a sharper edge. Not just a child's longing. A message. A bridge between Grace and him. Built-in whispers in small hands, clutching a photograph too old for her to understand, but too precious to let go. Samuel exhaled, the sound heavy, steadying. His hand found the ignition. Turn it slowly. The engine grumbled to life, a low, tired growl that seemed to echo the weight in his bones. He pulled out a lot, the tires crunching over the thin layer of frost beginning to creep across the pavement. The road stretched ahead, swallowed by fog and the faint silver wash of the moon above the clouds. He drove without the radio, the quiet filling the cab like a living thing. Every few miles, his hand would drift unconsciously to his jacket pocket, feeling the edge of the photograph like a man checking for a pulse. Haven Pines. The name sat cold and deliberate in his mind. He didn't know what waited behind its gates. A child. A truth. When the first sign for Haven Pines appeared on the roadside, half hidden by overgrown brush, Samuel's grip tightened on the wheel. The letters were neat, carved into a white wooden post. A new beginning for children, the kind of words meant to comfort. But under the weight of Grace's signature that wasn't, and the girl's whisper in the frost, they rang hollow. The road narrowed. The faint outline of low buildings, their trim a pale mint green. Warm light spilled from one window, muted by curtains. From a distance, it looked peaceful, safe. Samuel killed the engine, fills a room just before morning fully breaks. Not sudden, not loud, but certain. The horizon carried the faintest line of gold now, thin and brittle against the weight of the gray sky. Samuel watched it grow as the truck rolled slow over the cracked pavement, the sound of the tires blending into the low hum of the engine. The photograph warmed faintly against his chest through the fabric of his jacket, the edges worn soft enough that it felt less like paper and more like something living. He turned onto the long stretch of county road that would carry him back through the pines. The air here always smelled of sap and frozen earth, sharp and grounding. It wasn't beauty that caught him. It was the quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound you carry inside louder. The girl's whisper filled that space. "Daddy, Mom said you'd find me." Not as memory this time, but as something alive, threaded through every breath he took. Samuel's grip tightened on the wheel, leather creaking softly under his hands. The weight in his chest wasn't heaviness anymore. It was a pull. He pulled off onto a narrow turnout just before the first line of trees. The Chevy idled low for a moment before he cut the engine. The corner bent slightly now. Samuel opened it once more, his eyes landing on the discharge paper. Amelia Grace Hartman. The name was steady in black ink. Beneath it, the small fist. For Sam. His thumb brushed the faint crease again, the ridge where Amelia's small fingerprint had worn itself into the corner. That single touch felt louder than any voice. Samuel leaned back in the seat, the cab wrapping around him in its familiar weight. The air tasted of cold metal and old leather, and somewhere under it all, faint pine carried through the cracked window. His hand rested flat against the photograph, pressing it gently to the steady beat beneath his ribs. He said her name once under his breath. Samuel started the engine again, the low growl steady. The pines ahead leaned close, their branches heavy with frost, forming a tunnel of muted green and gray. The road back to the white gates stretched through them, quiet and deliberate. He shifted the truck into gear, the tires crunching lightly over the frost as he eased forward. The fog clung low to the ground, curling around the wheels like breath. Somewhere beyond those trees, a little girl in a yellow sweater was still holding a frayed rabbit and humming a song meant to keep the dark away. Somewhere in that room, Grace's last quiet trust waited to be answered. And when he spoke her name again, it came steady, no tremor left. Amelia. It filled the cab the way the first sliver of dawn filled the horizon. Not sudden, not loud, but undeniable. The first pale light of morning settled low over the trees as Samuel's truck crept back toward the stretch of road where the white gates waited. The pines rose tall on either side, their branches bowed under the weight of frost, dripping slow into the cold earth. The engine's hum felt muted, softened by the fog curling thick across the ground. Each turn of the wheel brought the familiar shape closer, the place where everything now hinged. He pulled off before the bend, the same patch of gravel where he'd stopped the day before. The Chevy settled with a faint creak, and Samuel cut the engine. The silence came fast, heavier than the fog outside. He sat there for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, breathing slow, the faint ache in his shoulders a reminder of how long he'd been carrying this weight. His fingers went to his jacket automatically, finding the worn edge of the photograph. He pulled it out carefully, unfolding it in the thin light. Grace's face met him again, and he could almost feel the faint ridge where Amelia's small fingerprint had left its mark. Samuel leaned his head back against the seat for a moment, the leather creaking softly. Outside, he slipped the photograph back inside his jacket, pressing it flat against his chest, letting the weight settle there. Then he opened the door. The cold hit fast, biting through wool and denim, sharp enough to make him draw one quick breath. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching against the thin crust of frost. The walk to the gate felt longer than it had the day before. Each step sounded loud in the quiet, the kind of sound that carried and the kind of silence that listened back. Samuel stopped just short of the bars, his gloved hand resting against the smooth, cold metal. The paint was still perfect, no rust, no wear. Beyond the gate, the building sat soft in the fog, the pale yellow light still glowing behind the mint green trim. His eyes found the window almost instantly. The one with the yellow curtain, the one hiding the small room where she had sat in the yellow sweater, humming to herself with the frayed rabbit clutched tight. That image rose clear and sharp, a thread pulling tight between this side of the bars and the other. Samuel exhaled slowly. He didn't move to the lock. Not yet. This wasn't a door to be forced. Grace had left a path drawn in small, quiet marks. A blank line on a birth certificate, a photograph folded and unfolded. A child whispering a name into frozen air. The next step had to carry the same weight. Samuel stepped back one pace, then another, his boots crunching softly against the frost. His eyes stayed on the yellow curtain through the fog glass, as if looking hard enough could make the space between them shorter. He whispered the name once low, letting it belong to the air between the gate and the room beyond. Amelia. The sound didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled into the cold morning like a promise taking root. Samuel rested both hands on the wheel and closed his eyes for a moment. The photograph was warm against his chest now, as if the paper itself had learned to hold its own heartbeat. Enough to make it real. Samuel didn't start the truck right away. He sat with his hands on the wheel, the leather soft beneath his palms. The weight of the photograph, a steady pressure against his chest. Outside, the fog hung heavy, muting the line of the trees, turning the world into soft edges and quiet shapes. He could still see the white gates through it, faint but unwavering, like they'd been waiting for him longer than he'd been driving toward them. His breath fogged the cab in slow, thin clouds. He lifted one hand and wiped the inside of the windshield absently, the streak of his glove clearing a narrow view of the frost-lined road. He thought of Grace then, not the woman in the hospital gown, not even the girl with grit in her voice in the field hospital, but the way she used to sit in silence beside him on long drives, her hand resting lightly on the dashboard as if anchoring the world. That memory came sharp now, a quiet weight he could almost feel in the empty seat next to him. Samuel reached for the photograph and unfolded it carefully. The paper was soft now, edges worn. Crease deep, Grace's eyes met him, steady even through exhaustion. The small fist pressed against the blanket seemed to reach beyond the frame. For Sam, he brushed his thumb over the ink. The familiar curve of her handwriting grounding him in a way nothing else could. The girl's voice cut through the silence again, not as echo, but as if she'd just whispered it beside him. Daddy. The thread, tying every mile back to this place. He opened them again and slipped the photograph back into his jacket, pressing it flat against the steady beat beneath his ribs. He turned the key halfway, letting the engine hum low. The sound didn't break the quiet so much as settle into it, like another heartbeat joining his own. His fingers tightened on the wheel as the truck rolled slowly forward, the gravel crunching under the tires until they hit smooth pavement. Caught the white paint in a way that made it glow faintly against the pale sky. Samuel killed the engine again and stepped out into the cold. The air bit sharper now. The metal looked the same, smooth, new, unyielding. He rested his gloved hand against it anyway. The chill bled through instantly, biting until his fingers ached. He let them. Why the cold in his bones felt less like punishment and more like a marker on the path Grace had drawn in silence. Samuel stepped back slowly, the frost crunching under his heels. He didn't touch the lock this time. Not yet. Some steps weren't meant to be rushed. Some doors had to be opened with the same quiet weight they were built to protect. He turned back to the truck, his breath trailing soft behind him in the thin morning light. His hand brushed the metal bar once more as he passed, the cold clinging to his fingertips long after he'd let go. Inside the cab, the photograph pressed warm against his chest again, as if carrying its own small fire. Samuel let his hands rest on the wheel and close his eyes, letting the name settle once more in the space between heartbeats. Amelia. It was the last sound in the cab before he turned the key and let the truck idle in place. The frost had thickened overnight, turning the ditch water into thin glass and coating the pines in a white shimmer that looked almost delicate. Samuel's truck sat quiet on the edge of the road. Engine off, breath fogging the cab in soft clouds. The white gates of Haven Pines were still visible through the fog ahead, a shape that felt less like a barrier now and more like a line drawn in the dirt. Samuel's hand rested flat against his jacket, over the photograph pressed against his chest. He hadn't taken out this time. He didn't need to. Grace's eyes were there every time he closed his own, steady and tired and unflinching. The small fist in the blanket, the words that had pulled him this far. For Sam. The girl's voice layered over it, soft but cutting. Daddy, Mom said you'd find me. That single sentence had become the rhythm under every step, every mile. Not a memory now, a command, a promise waiting for its answer. He opened the door slowly, the cold slapping his face in that sharp, metallic way December carries. His boots crunched against the frost, each sound loud and the kind of quiet that feels alive. He walked toward the gate. She'd left him quiet marks, small enough to miss unless he were willing to stop and feel them. A blank line on a birth certificate, a folded photograph, a child's whisper in the frost. Samuel stepped back one pace, then another. His breath fogged the air between him and the gate, a thin veil hanging in the cold. He whispered the name once, soft and steady. Amelia. The sound sat heavy in the morning air, settling into the frost, into the metal, into him. Not a call, not a plea, a vow. He turned and walked back to the truck, his boots marking the white crust of earth. His hand brushed the gate once more as he passed, the cold clinging to his fingertips. Inside the cab, the silence wrapped tight again, but it didn't feel as heavy. It felt held. Samuel rested his hands on the wheel and closed his eyes for a moment. The photograph burned faintly against his chest. Grace's voice, if he could imagine it now, wouldn't have been loud. It would have been steady. Go careful, Sam, but go. He opened his eyes and turned the key. The engine rumbled low, the sound settling into the quiet like another heartbeat. The fog ahead shifted slightly, the white gates still waiting. The yellow curtain beyond them holding the shape of a life Grace had protected with every ounce of herself. Samuel said the name once more under his breath, steady as the hum of the engine. Amelia, the kind that whispers and still moves mountains. The fog clung thicker now, soft and heavy, swallowing sound before it had a chance to stretch far. Samuel's truck idled low at the edge of the gravel turnout, the hum of the engine barely louder than the slow rhythm of his own breathing. His hand stayed on his jacket. Fingers spread over the photograph. He hadn't unfolded it this time. He didn't need to. Grace's eyes were there behind his eyelids. Every time they closed, the tired steadiness. Not an omission, a shield. Samuel leaned back against the seat for a moment, the worn leather creaking quietly. The photograph's edge pressed soft into his chest, and for the briefest second, he imagined what it would feel like for small hands to press there instead. Tentative, light but real. He pushed the thought down quickly, not because it hurt, but because it felt too fragile to hold yet. He opened the door and stepped into the cold, the air biting quick and sharp. The white paint seemed to glow faintly in the muted light, too clean against the gray of the trees. He stopped short again, his gloved hand resting against the cold metal bar. The chill seeped fast, a bite that sank past skin into bone. He welcomed it. Pain like this meant you were standing in a place where something mattered enough to hurt. Beyond the gate, the yellow curtain was still drawn, soft against the pale glass. He could almost see her there without seeing. The yellow sweater, the frayed rabbit ear brushing her cheek. He whispered the name once, letting it belong to the space between the gate and the small room beyond. Amelia. The sound didn't echo. It didn't need to. It settled into the frost, into the metal under his hand, into the quiet air holding everything still. He stepped back slowly, the frost crunching under his boots, the white mist curling low around his ankles. His eyes stayed on the yellow curtain until the fog blurred it out. When he turned back toward the truck, his hand brushed the bar one more time, the cold clinging stubbornly to his fingertips as if it wanted to leave a mark. Inside the cab, the photograph burned faintly against his chest. He rested both hands on the wheel and let the hum of the engine fold into the silence. Grace's voice, if he could imagine it now, would have been soft, the kind of softness that still carried steel. Somewhere beyond them was a little girl in a yellow sweater, still clutching a frayed rabbit, still humming a song against the quiet. Somewhere beyond them. The sound filled the cab and settled into his chest the way the photograph had. Quiet, unshakable, carrying the weight of small hands he hadn't held yet but already belonged to. The frost had thickened into a brittle crust that cracked softly under each boot step as Samuel crossed the gravel again. The morning light was sharper now, though not warmer. It skimmed the tops of the pines in a thin line of pale gold, turning every branch into glass. The fog clung low, soft tendrils curling over the road and the white gates ahead. The truck sat silent behind him, its engine finally cooled to quiet metal. He stopped at the bars again, his gloved hand resting against the cold paint. The bite of it felt sharper today, like the frost itself was testing his resolve. He welcomed it. Beyond the gate, the buildings were still hushed, their mint green trim muted by the mist. His eyes found the yellow curtain instantly. The same soft fold of fabric guarding the room where a child's hum had stitched itself into his chest. Samuel reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph, unfolding it carefully as if the paper itself carried something alive. Grace's eyes met him again, steady and tired and unflinching. The small fist in the blanket, the words beneath. For Sam. Not from the wind, but from the weight of everything it carried. Grace's trust, a child's whisper, his own fear of breaking something so fragile. Samuel tucked the photograph back inside his jacket and stepped closer. His other hand found the lock, not to force it, just to feel the weight of it. The metal was colder than the bar, biting through the glove in a way that felt like a question. He closed his fingers around it gently and whispered the name into the fog. Amelia. Something in the silence shifted. Not the lock. The quiet wrapped around him, thicker than the fog outside. He thought of Grace then, not in a memory of laughter or goodbye, but in the way she'd always looked at him when words weren't enough. Samuel opened his eyes and let the breath he'd been holding slip out slow. His hand went to the photograph one more time, pressing it flat against the steady beat under his ribs. For Sam. He turned the key halfway, letting the engine hum to life. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It felt steady, like something answering back. The fog outside shifted. It felt like the sound an unlocked door makes. Not loud, not triumphant, just the quiet click of something finally opening after being held closed too long. The fog hadn't lifted, but the light had changed. It came thin and cold through the branches, turning the frost into a dull shimmer. Samuel's boots crunched softly as he crossed the gravel again. The sound sharp in the still morning. The photograph was pressed against his chest under the jacket, its edges worn enough now that it felt less like paper and more like a heartbeat. He stopped at the white gates, his gloved hand resting on the cold metal bar. The chill bled through instantly, the sting grounding him. Beyond the bars, the buildings sat quiet in the mist. Every whisper, every breath had been leading. Samuel pulled the photograph free, careful even though the paper had grown soft from being held too many times. Grace's tired but steady eyes met him again, the small fist in the blanket, the words that had become the line, pulling him through frost and silence. For Sam. He brushed his thumb over the ink, slow, deliberate, letting the weight of those two words settle in his bones. His breath fogged faintly as he exhaled, the white cloud hanging between him and the gate. He stepped closer, his other hand finding the lock, the metal bit colder than the bar, sharp enough to sting through the glove. Samuel closed his fingers around it, not to force, just to feel its weight. The photograph burned faintly against his chest like it knew. Each step deliberate. His hand brushed the cold bar once more as he turned back toward the truck. The fog curled low around his ankles, soft and pale in the muted light. Inside the cab, the room came alive, the yellow sweater, the frayed rabbit, the small shoulders carrying more weight than they should. And those eyes, wide, brown, open in a way that carried everything Grace had left behind. Samuel started the engine. The low growl filled the cab, soft but certain. The photograph warmed faintly against his chest. He said the name once more under his breath, letting it settle into the hum of the engine, into the steady beat beneath his ribs. Amelia. The sound didn't echo. It didn't need to. It felt like the first step over a threshold. Not a door slammed open. Not a charge. Just the quiet moment where the world shifts because you finally move from outside to in. As the truck rolled back onto the road, the white gates faded into the fog behind him, but the weight of them didn't leave. It pressed into him, steady and sure. The way small hands would someday rest against his chest. Not tentative, not questioning, just knowing they'd found home. The fog wrapped the building like a held breath as Samuel eased the truck into the narrow service lane. The engine ticked low when he killed it, leaving only the sound of frost cracking faintly under cooling metal. The photograph pressed steady against his chest as he stepped out, boots meeting the cold earth with a crunch that felt louder than it should have. The world here wasn't silent. It was listening. He moved along the side of the building, the mint green trim pale in the dim light. His hand brushed the wall as he passed, the paint cold and smooth under the glove. Every step brought him closer to the small window with a yellow curtain, making the inside a blur of pale shapes. He leaned close enough to see past them, breath fogging the glass for a second before clearing. There she was, the yellow sweater. The frayed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. Her hair was pulled back messily, a small strand loose against her cheek. She sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, her small shoulders rising and falling with the faintest hum. No words, just sound, a song meant to keep herself from disappearing. Samuel's hand lifted instinctively, his palm resting flat against the cold glass. The frost bit instantly, sharp enough to make his fingers ache. He didn't move it. The photograph burned faintly against his chest, and for a moment he could almost imagine the thin warmth of small fingers on the other side of the pane. Her head turned suddenly, eyes lifting, wide, brown, open in that way that cut straight through him. For a second, neither of them moved. The hum stopped, hanging in the air like a thread about to break. Samuel whispered the name before he could think. Amelia. It didn't reach her through the glass. It didn't need to. Her small fingers loosened their grip on the frayed rabbit for just a second, then tightened again, as if anchoring herself to something she couldn't name yet. He stepped back slowly, letting his hand fall from the glass. The frost had left a faint outline of his palm there, a brief mark that would vanish as soon as the air shifted. His boots crunched softly against the frost as he moved back toward the corner of the building, the fog curling low around his ankles. Inside the cab, the silence was a weight. Samuel sat with his hands resting on the wheel, not turning the key, not moving. His breath fogged the air in slow clouds. His hand pressed flat against the photograph again, the crease soft under his palm. Grace's steady eyes, the small fist, the words at the bottom. For Sam. Samuel exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more than air. He said her name once more into the quiet cab, steady this time, not as a question, not as a plea. Amelia. The sound settled into the space like a promise. Not loud, not triumphant, just the quiet vow of someone finally standing at the edge of the life they were meant to hold. The world outside the cab held its breath as Samuel sat motionless, his hands still resting on the wheel. The image of the small room lingered behind his eyes, the yellow curtain drawn halfway, the pale walls, the child on the narrow bed. The hum she'd been making still seemed to vibrate in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it had ever truly reached him through the glass, or if it was something his heart had simply decided to keep. His thumb brushing the faint crease. Grace's tired but steady eyes met him again, the small fist pressed against the blanket. For Sam. Being seemed heavier today, as if the weight of those words had grown each time he'd read them. Samuel leaned forward, resting the photograph lightly against the steering wheel. His breath fogged the cab in slow clouds. For one heartbeat, it had felt like the world stilled just so they could see each other. He opened his eyes and slipped the photograph back into his jacket, pressing it against the steady rhythm under his ribs. His hand lingered there, palm flat, as if anchoring it. The name formed quietly in his mouth, almost without sound. Amelia. The fog outside had thickened again, soft tendrils curling low over the ground. Samuel stepped out of the cab slowly, the cold hitting fast, sharp enough to make his breath catch. His boots crunched against the frost as he moved toward the side of the building again. Each step sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. The yellow curtain came into view through the mist, the faint glow behind the glass making it stand out like a beacon. Samuel stopped short, his breath hanging pale in front of him. He reached up and rested his gloved hand against the cold pane. The frost bit through instantly, sharp enough to ache. Inside, the girl sat in the same spot, the frayed rabbit still held tight against her chest. Her small shoulders lifted and fell with a soft rhythm. Then, as if sensing something, her head turned. Those eyes again, wide, brown, open in a way that felt too heavy for someone so small. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He didn't speak this time. He didn't move. He just let himself stand there, letting her look at him through the thin layer of frost and glass. For a moment, the world narrowed to that small space between their eyes. He stepped back slowly, letting his hand fall from the pane. The faint outline of his palm stayed there for a second before the cold air blurred it. His boots crunched softly against the frost as he turned back toward the truck, the fog curling low around his ankles like it was holding on to him for a moment longer. Inside the cab, the silence felt different now. Not emptier, just heavier in a way that carried something alive. Samuel rested both hands on the wheel and closed his eyes. The photograph burned faintly against his chest, Grace's ink and Amelia's small fingerprint pressed together in the same crease. He whispered the name one more time, steady and quiet, letting it settle into the hum of his breath. Amelia. It didn't feel like a call now. It felt like an answer, one that had been waiting years to be spoken out loud. The morning had settled into a soft gray, the kind of light that doesn't grow or fade but holds everything in suspension. Samuel sat in the cab longer than he meant to, the photograph pressed against his chest under his jacket, its edges molding now to the curve of his body. He could still feel the faint ridge of the crease through the fabric, the ghost of a small fingerprint in the corner. Amelia's. That tiny mark had become heavier than any weight he'd carried in war. He started the engine, the old Chevy rumbling low in the quiet, then cut it again after a moment. The sound of the key turning off seemed to echo louder than the hum itself. His hand stayed on the wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather. He let out a long breath, the kind that feels like it carries more than air, and reached for the door handle. The cold hit instantly when he stepped out, sharp enough to bite in a bone. His boots crunched against the frost as he walked the now familiar path to the side of the building. The fog clung low, soft tendrils curling over the earth, muting the sound of his steps. The white gates stood behind him, fading into the mist like a line he'd already crossed. The yellow curtain came into view. The frayed rabbit clutched her chest. Her head was bowed slightly, as if she'd been humming again. Then, slowly, she looked up. Those wide, brown eyes met his through the thin layer of glass and frost, and for a second, the world stilled. Samuel's throat tightened. He didn't speak at first. He let the moment hold itself. And one of her small hands moved unconsciously toward the glass, stopping just shy of it. Samuel pressed his palm flat against the pane, the frost biting deeper now. For a second, the distance between skin and skin felt paper thin. He stepped back slowly, careful not to break whatever had just passed between them. The outline of his hand stayed on the glass for a heartbeat before the cold air blurred it away. His boots crunched softly against the frost as he turned back toward the truck, the fog curling low around his legs like it wanted to hold the moment in place. Inside the cab, the silence wasn't heavy this time. It was full. His hands rested on the wheel, fingers trembling just slightly now. He leaned back against the seat, the photograph warm against his chest, Grace's steady eyes and Amelia's small mark pressed together in the same fold. The kind of word that doesn't move the world with noise, but with the stillness that comes when something finally finds its place. Winter didn't break all at once. It softened in small ways. Frost clung shorter each morning. The wind carried less bite, and the sun lingered a little longer on the edge of the pines. Samuel learned to measure time differently now, not in miles or missions, but in small, ordinary things. A yellow sweater folded over the back of a chair. The soft thud of small feet crossing the old wooden floor. A frayed rabbit mended clumsily with new stitches, still carrying every scar of the old ones. Amelia's voice had grown louder, not in volume, but in presence. Sometimes it was just a hum over breakfast. Sometimes a single question asked with a weight of trust that had taken years to build before it was ever spoken. "Daddy, are we staying here?" And Samuel, with his hands still rough from a life spent carrying other things, would smooth her hair and answer the only way that mattered. "Yeah, we're staying." There was no victory parade here, no headlines, no grand moment to mark the return. Just a man and a child in a small house at the edge of the woods, learning that sometimes survival isn't about fighting, it's about staying. Staying long enough for the silence to become safe. Staying long enough for the word home to mean something again. Grace's photograph sat on the shelf above the table. Her tired, steady eyes still watching, the small fist in the blanket still curled as if it knew this day would come. Samuel didn't talk to the picture often, but when Amelia laughed, when the house filled with something gentle again, he would glance up and whisper, "We made it." If you've ever lost something and found it again in a way you didn't expect, or if you're still waiting for that quiet, healing return, leave your thoughts below. Maybe this isn't just Samuel's story.